Cali, Colombia. A city that lived in the aftershocks of Pablo Escobar's war. Streets still carried whispers of bombs, gunfire, and the endless funerals of men who thought they were kings. By the early 1960s, this was the world Wilber Varela was born into. A country where power was measured not in votes, but in bullets. He wasn't born into wealth, nor into desperation. He grew up in the gray zone in between, where young men dreamed of escaping poverty but had no maps to follow. Colombia had no heroes left, only narcos, sicarios, and politicians who looked the other way. For boys like Varela, crime wasn't rebellion. It was survival dressed as ambition. As a teenager, he watched the fall of Escobar and the rise of new power brokers. The Cali cartel, more disciplined, more calculating, less flamboyant than Medellin. The message was clear. Brutality could build empires, but strategy kept them alive. Varela learned early that he had no intention of being invisible. First, he joined the police, a uniform that gave him both legitimacy and access. But the badge was not a shield. It was a key to contacts, to information, to power. And slowly, the boy from Cali began to step from the shadows of Escobar's ghost into his own story. Wilber Varela wore the police uniform like a costume. To the public, he was a guardian of order. But in the alleys of Cali, he was something else entirely. A man taking notes, learning names, studying the ecosystem of power. The badge gave him authority, but it was the streets that gave him purpose. It didn't take long before Varela realized that law enforcement was just another business in Colombia. Bribes passed as naturally as coins in a marketplace. Files disappeared. Suspects were released. And the line between protector and predator vanished. For him, joining the police wasn't about honor. It was about access. When he crossed that invisible line, he did it without hesitation. He began working as an enforcer for the Norte del Valle cartel, a rising faction eager to take the throne left behind by Cali's crumbling dynasty. Varela earned his nickname, Jabón, soap, because he left no trace of those who opposed him. He cleaned the streets with blood, washing away rivals as if they had never existed. Unlike many sicarios, Varela didn't kill recklessly. Each hit was precise, calculated, almost clinical. He studied his enemies, waited for their weakest moment, and struck without mercy. Efficiency was his signature, and brutality his language. By the mid-1990s, Wilber Varela was no longer a policeman. He was a ghost in uniform, a man whose loyalty belonged not to the state, but to the cartel. And in the silence after every shot, his legend began to spread. The Norte del Valle cartel was born from opportunity. After the fall of Cali, its leaders inherited smuggling routes, corrupt officials, and the promise of billions in cocaine profits. At first, it was a brotherhood, men bound together by ambition, by the idea that Colombia's future lay in their hands, not Bogotá's. But greed has no loyalty. As money poured in, unity began to rot. Some wanted to stay discreet, to operate like businessmen in the shadows. Others, hungrier, bolder, wanted to rule like kings, drowning their rivals in blood. What began as business meetings turned into death sentences. Wilber Varela found himself at the center of this storm. He had risen fast, earning the trust of powerful bosses. Yet trust in the Norte del Valle was fragile, always one whispered rumor away from betrayal. Varela aligned with one faction, only to see another rise against him. Allies became enemies overnight, and old friends transformed into targets. The cartel fractured into war. Streets once ruled by quiet deals now echoed with gunfire. Entire towns were pulled into the conflict, forced to choose sides in a battle they never asked for. For the people, it meant kidnappings, extortion, and sudden massacres. For the cartel, it meant rivers of money, but also rivers of blood. By the late 1990s, the Norte del Valle cartel was no longer a united empire. It was a battlefield, and in the middle of it all stood Jabón, a man who thrived not in peace but in chaos. In the war for control of Norte del Valle, bullets were not just tools of death. They were instruments of messaging. Wilber Varela understood this better than most. To him, violence wasn't random. It was theater. Every corpse, every headline, every whispered rumor was part of a strategy designed to keep his enemies paralyzed. Bodies began appearing in grotesque displays. Men strung from bridges like broken dolls, heads left in plazas as warnings. Sugarcane fields, once symbols of Colombia's fertile valleys, became graveyards where dozens were buried in silence. Each scene carried the same message. Betrayal has a price, and Jabón will collect it. Fear became a currency more powerful than cocaine. It controlled soldiers more effectively than payroll, and silenced communities better than bribes. Entire neighborhoods turned into ghost towns after his men passed through, leaving behind not only the dead, but also the knowledge that anyone could be next. Yet, for all its horror, Varela's terror was methodical. He didn't kill for spectacle alone. Every assassination, every massacre had a purpose: removing rivals, dismantling networks, forcing survivors into submission. He wanted control, and he found that nothing controlled men more completely than the promise of pain. By the early 2000s, Jabón's reign of fear had reshaped Colombia's criminal landscape. He was no longer just an enforcer. He was an architect of terror, carving his empire into the nation's memory with blood. Every empire eventually meets its rival. For Wilber Varela, that rival was Diego León Montoya Sanchez, known simply as Don Diego. If Varela was cold precision, Don Diego was brute authority. Both men wanted the same prize: absolute control of the Norte del Valle cartel. And in Colombia, there was never room for two kings. What began as quiet disagreements over routes and profits soon exploded into open war. Soldiers loyal to Don Diego clashed with Varela's sicarios in towns across the Valle del Cauca. Shootings erupted in broad daylight. Families vanished overnight. Roads turned into ambush zones, and the once profitable smuggling corridors became killing fields. This was not a cartel anymore. It was a civil war. Each man believed he carried the true legacy of Norte del Valle, and each swore to erase the other. Intelligence leaks, bribed officials, even paramilitary groups were dragged into the fight. No ally could be trusted for long. Betrayal was as common as the gunfire echoing through the countryside. For ordinary Colombians, the war was apocalyptic. Farmers stumbled upon mass graves. Entire villages fled under threat. The cartel's wealth, instead of stabilizing communities, fueled destruction at a scale that rivaled Colombia's guerrilla conflicts. By the early 2000s, the battle between Jabón and Don Diego was no longer about business. It was personal. It was pride, vengeance, and the need to prove who truly owned the crown. And as the bodies piled higher, Colombia itself became the throne they fought upon. No cartel survives on violence alone. Power in Colombia was never just about guns. It was about alliances. And Wilber Varela knew that shadows often carried more weight than armies. He built networks with paramilitary groups who already controlled vast stretches of the countryside. These armed militias, fighting under the banner of ideology, found common cause with Jabón's empire of cocaine. They provided muscle, protection, and access to rural zones where coca fields thrived. In return, Varela's money kept their war machines alive. Corruption, too, became a weapon. Police commanders, prosecutors, even politicians quietly bent the knee. Files disappeared, arrest warrants were delayed, and operations collapsed before they began. Some officers looked the other way. Others became active collaborators, guiding Jabón's men through raids or handing over rivals to be executed. The state itself became one more pawn on his chessboard. And then there were the deals across the border. Mexico's cartels, Sinaloa and others, needed steady cocaine supplies, and Varela was willing to deliver. In exchange, he gained protection, cash, and access to the most powerful trafficking routes in the Americas. The partnership extended his reach far beyond Colombia's valleys, embedding him in the global drug trade. In these hidden pacts lay Jabón's real strength. Not the bodies hanging from bridges, but the quiet handshakes in hotel rooms and jungle camps. It was here, in the shadows, that his empire grew roots deep enough to outlast any single battle. Even the strongest empires can crumble from within. For Wilber Varela, the threat was never just Don Diego or rival cartels. It was the men he trusted most. Alliances forged in shadows are fragile, and loyalty in the drug world is a currency that can vanish overnight. Betrayal began quietly. A missed delivery here, a leaked plan there. Friends whispered deals with rivals, and messages meant for his eyes alone found their way into enemy hands. Each act of treachery was a reminder that in Jabón's world, trust was lethal. By the mid-2000s, paranoia became as vital as strategy. Varela scrutinized every lieutenant, every hitman, every courier. But even a king cannot watch all eyes at once. One night, as he slept in a safe house in Venezuela, a circle he believed loyal turned against him. Ambushed, cornered, and outnumbered, Jabón found that empires built on fear alone can topple when fear shifts to your own ranks. The war that had once spilled blood across Colombia now turned inward. Men who once carried out his orders without question now plotted his end. And Varela realized the cruel truth. Power attracts enemies, but betrayal comes from those you call family. By the time the news reached the streets of Cali, the man who had once commanded terror across continents was gone. His fall was swift, quiet, and inevitable. An empire in chaos, leaving only whispers and blood-soaked legends behind. Wilber Varela fled Colombia, chasing safety in Venezuela, but no distance could shield him from the empire he once commanded. The same men who had carried out his orders, who had killed and extorted under his command, now hunted him with relentless precision. In the narco world, loyalty is fleeting, and power often dies before the body does. Cornered in a safe house, Jabón realized that escape was no longer an option. Every door was watched, every ally questioned. Venezuela's streets, once a sanctuary, had become a trap. Messages from his inner circle, once trusted as allies, revealed that betrayal was inevitable. The empire he had built on fear had turned against him. He was silenced not by rivals across borders, but by his own men. Ambushes, knives, and guns, the instruments of his own reign, became the instruments of his demise. The violence he had perfected became the violence that ended him. His death was sudden, stark, and merciless, leaving no chance for redemption or reflection. Even in death, Jabón's legend persisted. News of his fall rippled across Colombia and Mexico, a reminder that the highest towers can collapse from within. Men whispered his name with fear and respect, knowing that the king who once ruled with terror had finally been claimed by the very world he had manipulated. The streets of Cali returned to a tense quiet, but the shadow of Wilber Varela lingered. His empire may have fractured, but his methods, the terror, the strategy, the betrayals, continued to shape the criminal underworld. Wilber Varela was gone, but his empire had left an indelible mark. The Norte del Valle cartel, once a disciplined machine of cocaine and corruption, splintered into factions, each fighting for scraps of territory and power. Yet the chaos Jabón had sown did not die with him. It multiplied. Violence became instinct, fear became inheritance, and the streets he once controlled still trembled under his shadow. His methods, precision hits, public displays of terror, and ruthless elimination of rivals set a blueprint for the next generation of criminals. Men who had witnessed him kill, bribe, and manipulate now carried forward his tactics as if studying a manual written in blood. Colombia's valleys, sugarcane fields, and urban corners became classrooms, teaching lessons in survival and domination. Even governments and law enforcement felt his lingering presence. Corruption, instability, and intimidation remained tools of control in regions once governed by Jabón. Politicians, police, and rival cartels alike moved carefully, aware that the ghost of Varela still influenced decisions, alliances, and betrayals. And for the people of Colombia, the cost of his legacy was human. Families torn apart, towns emptied, and memories of terror etched into every street. Jabón was dead, but the violence he unleashed had outlived him. An empire of blood without a king, yet still unmistakably his. Some men wash away their sins. He washed away everyone else's, in blood.